section 42.4 is the last section we're going to go over for the ecology section for this unit. And this section is about the biological and geochemical processes that help recycle nutrients and water in ecosystems. So if you remember, we've talked about how energy flows through the ecosystems, but chemicals are cycled through and nutrients are cycled through. So the life on Earth as we know it depends on the recycling of these elements. And if you recall, decomposers play a big role in this because they help break down dead material and release those broken down materials back into the atmosphere and the earth where it can be used again. So that's a good thing. And we really, really depend on those decomposers to do their job so that we're able to continue to sustain life in the ecosystems. The rate that our nutrient cycle depends on the ecosystem, but it depends on the rate of decomposition. And that then depends on the organisms that do the decomposition, which are the decomposers. So their growth and decomposition rate are controlled by things like temperature, moisture, and the availability of their nutrients. Now, when we look at decomposers, let's see, I'm going to break us down a little bit. Cycles, we call these biogeochemical cycles because they involve both our biotic, living, and abiotic, non-living factors. And these biogeochemical cycles may be global or local. And we'll talk about what constitutes those differences. And you've heard of quite a few of these before, so these should be a little bit familiar to you. We have some nutrients that have a gas phase. They're able to exist in the gas phase. So carbon exists a lot as carbon dioxide, oxygen, O2, sulfur, S2, and nitrogen, N2, can enter the atmosphere. So because they can exist in the atmosphere as gases, they can cycle globally. We have other elements and important nutrients such as phosphorus, potassium, and calcium that don't really tend to exist in the gaseous phase. And so these have to cycle more locally in terrestrial ecosystems on Earth, but they can have a little bit broader cycling when they're dissolved in water in aquatic ecosystems. So these would be more of our local biogeochemical cycles. Now, when we're thinking about these biogeochemical cycles, you don't necessarily need to memorize them. On the AP Bio test, they're not going to ask you to memorize them, but I'm just going to point out some important aspects of each of them, why they're used, and kind of the most commonly used parts of the cycle and how the elements change. But if you're not familiar with any of these cycles, I would recommend taking a look at the photo in your textbook that really breaks them down very, very well, and just kind of review those. But the water cycle, obviously, very, very important because water is necessary for all living organisms. We mostly use water in the liquid form, but it can also be used as a gas. And one of the main processes that helps cycle water through the ecosystems is evaporation. So when water is liquid on the surface of the earth, it can evaporate. When it cools down, it will condense into clouds and then eventually precipitate out, fall. And then we also talked about how plants can take up water from the surface of the earth, and it kind of leaves through the leaves, and that process is called transpiration. So those are pretty much all of the main processes of the water cycle, but they're all pretty useful. And here you can see a photo of it happening. The carbon cycle, very important. Now, you may not think that you know about the carbon cycle, but you actually are probably fairly familiar with it. The carbon cycle is important because carbon-based organic molecules are essential for all living things as well. So any compound that has carbon in it pretty much is considered to be organic, and all these organic molecules, like your macromolecules, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, they all contain carbon, and we need those for life. So the two major processes that give us carbon are photosynthesis and cellular respiration. And we can find carbon in a lot of locations on Earth. But essentially, carbon dioxide is used in the process of photosynthesis. So they take that carbon from the atmosphere and they build photosynthesis builds glucose, which contains carbon. But that's carbon that we can use as energy. And then through the process of cellular respiration, we break down that energy, that glucose, and in the end, we release carbon dioxide. So carbon cycles through the atmosphere in that way. Other activities that help release carbon are volcanic activity and the burning of fossil fuels. And there are also some animations that you can view on Mastering Biology and some images of the carbon cycle that you can take a look at. Let's see. There we go, the carbon cycle. So you see your burning of fossil fuels, we've got decomposition, cellular respiration, and photosynthesis, all are involved. The nitrogen cycle is another important cycle, and the reason why nitrogen is important is because it's a part of amino acids, proteins, and nucleic acids, which are needed for life. And also, as you saw, it's a major factor in the primary productivity of a particular ecosystem. It's a limiting nutrient. So plants typically will use ammonium, which is NH4 plus, as well as nitrate, NO3 minus, and they can also find nitrogen in amino acids. Bacteria can use nitrate, but animals can only use the organic forms of nitrogen, those amino acids and proteins and nucleic acids. So really the nitrogen cycle is important because it helps plants to convert the nitrogen they get from the atmosphere to substances they can use like ammonium and nitrate, and then in that process they can create the other organic compounds that animals can use and get their nitrogen from. And then in a similar vein, we'll show the phosphorus cycle, but here is some images of the nitrogen cycle. And then finally, the phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus is another limiting nutrient. Phosphorus is found in nucleic acids and is very important in phospholipids as well. So phospholipids make up the cell membrane, and ATP. So ATP we're going to learn about stands for adenosine triphosphate. There's 3 phosphate groups in there. This is what a phosphate looks like, PO4. It has a 3 minus charge. And this phosphate can be used in a variety of ways. When we pull a phosphate group off of ATP to make ADP, we get some energy there. So that's kind of why our phosphate groups are important. There's a lot of there's a lot of ways we get phosphorus. One is the weathering of rock, and then the phosphorus can leach into the ground and surface water. We find it in a lot of organic molecules like nucleic acids, phospholipids, etc. In the feces of animals, we find some phosphorus, and then decomposition can also release phosphorus. And that's how we get it back into the particular environment. So you can see here are some examples of phosphorus coming in. So the weathering of rocks gives us some phosphorus. We get some runoff water. Plants are able to take it up, and then it might get consumed by a primary consumer, secondary, so on. And then in decomposition, we get that phosphorus released back. And I believe that is the end of 42.4.